We'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association Lunch and Learn webinar, preparing for comments on the proposed ag water section of FDA's produce safety rule. I'm Adrian Card with Colorado State University Extension and a board member of the Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. This webinar is intended to help you understand FDA's proposed ag rule as part of the Food Safety Modernization Act's produce safety rule, and to prepare you to comment to FDA should you choose to do so. And that due date for comments is April the 5th, so that's coming right up. Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association is the go-to resource for Colorado's fresh fruit and vegetable farmers. We connect Colorado growers with industry, government, academia, and consumers to strengthen and expand Colorado fresh food and vegetable production. Learn more at coloradoproduce.org and follow CFVGA on Facebook and Instagram. CFVGA wants to thank its sponsors at the platinum level: John Deere, Western Growers, and Western Sayre; gold level, Agfinity, American Ag Credit, and Cicada Farms. And I'll show you the silver ones. I won't name them all since there's so many of these. But these businesses help to advance produce sector interest in Colorado, so CFVGA encourages you to learn more about them. So a bit of housekeeping. We will do interactions through the Q&A box that is enabled in the webinar, so go ahead and open that, become familiar with it. You will be able to see everyone's questions, and you'll be able to upvote any of those questions. If several of you land on one and you want to see Eduardo answer those. As you know, you can resize Zoom to fit whatever window fits best in your monitor. And we're going to conduct a couple of polls just to prime the pump and get you guys ready to hear from Eduardo. So first off, tell me this: are you familiar with the proposed ag water rule? And for those of you that move fast through this polling, go ahead and answer the second one. Are you considering submitting comments to FDA? Great. Well, Eduardo, it looks like we have one person really familiar and others really want to learn more, somewhat familiar and not familiar. And we may have some folks commenting, so that's good to see. Thank you, guys. Great. And here are the results to see for the full poll. So without further ado, Dr. Eduardo Gutierrez Rodriguez is an assistant professor in food safety systems in the horticulture department at CSU. He has over 20 years of research, extension, and business experience in food safety, focusing on fresh produce and minimally processed food environments. His research centers on understanding the microbial ecology of human pathogens within farm and food processing environments, looking at microbial interactions, risk assessment, and remediation practices that can sustain fruit and vegetable production and transfer human pathogens into the food supply chain. His involvement in the food industry includes guiding research, and developing policy and quality assurance departments in US and Costa Rica, and in the development of benchmarks on on-farm processing, validation, risk assessment, water systems, co-management, washing fresh produce, sanitation, bioremediation, and preservation practices. So Eduardo, thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to unshare. I can find that command over here and get this passed over to you.
I hate those introductions. I've never, oh my God, it's every time I hear them, I want to turn it off. But anyway, it is what it is. Thank you guys for being here today. Hopefully, today's seminar or webinar will allow you to understand a little bit more about the water or new water rule requirements. Please know that I am the messenger. There are certain things that I may not be able to answer just because of the aspects associated with the rule. Okay, so I just want to make sure that everybody can see my screenshot. If so, I mean, hopefully somebody can put in the chat that they can see my screen.
Looks
Adrian,
great.
can you see it? Okay,
Yeah.
perfectly. So today we're basically going to concentrate on subsection E, as it's listed here, subsection E of the produce safety rule that is specific to ag water. Okay, by now, most of the individuals that could be here need to comply with all other requirements from the produce safety regulation. And as we have said before, the subsection E, which is agricultural water, is the one that has been pending for quite some time. Okay, so one of the things that I always try to address, and I want to put it out front here, is that the produce safety rule and aspects associated with produce safety rule have been based on risk analysis. And now more than ever, specifically for this new water approach, the risk analysis of water is very important. So if you have taken the produce safety rule, you have seen this slide, slide number 26 from chapter 1 of the produce safety rule training. And this one is going to become quite important as you get into all water aspects related to the new rule. So some things that I think it's important for us to keep track and to be able to know that stay consistent. So the definition of agricultural water stays the same, which is basically water that will be in direct contact with the harvestable portion of the crop. The question that we typically get asked is, what is the harvestable portion of the crop? And of course, we're talking about it from the standpoint of the moment that you have a bud, the moment that you have a flower, that is where the harvestable portion of the crop starts. And so from that point on, then you need to take into account the microbial quality of the water. Aspects that continue to be the same is that you can have the same level of municipal well or surface water sources, the level of risk, meaning how hazardous they could be, increase as you go from municipal to well water to surface waters, being the riskier ones. From the standpoint of the application methods, of course, overhead irrigation continues to be the riskiest one. So if you're thinking of the new water rule and the risk assessment, then depending on the water source and depending on the method of application of this water, then your risk could be higher or lower. And it, of course, can be used in many times across the cropping cycle, at sowing, during the cropping cycle, or close to harvest. And of course, at the beginning, when you're putting the seedling or the plant or anything else, the risk is low. But as you're getting close to harvest, the risk level increases. So all those aspects remain the same. So we need to talk about it as a before and after. So before December 2021, FDA, and under the proposed previous rules, define what sanitary quality of water was. So FDA would give us specifically what was that criteria to consider water safe. And one of the most important things that has changed right now with the new proposed rule is that the farms are going to be deciding what is the sanitary quality of agricultural water. I cannot emphasize enough how important that is. We are moving from us having a criteria that was given by FDA to one in which the farmer or the individual using this agricultural water needs to define the sanitary quality of the water. So that is an important difference that we need to think of. So let's just briefly see what used to be in the rule. So we're going to briefly touch about those aspects that were important until December 2021. Again, at that point, FDA gave us what is the microbial quality of the water. So in that stage, the question that we had to ask ourselves is this first one here. Is water going to be in direct contact with the harvestable portion of the crop? If the answer was no, then the microbial water quality profile was not necessary because it was not going to be in contact with the harvestable portion. If the water was going to be in direct contact with that, then we basically had three options. One, which was to develop this microbial water quality profile. Another one was to use or follow some alternative provisions that I'm briefly going to touch later on. Or the third one, that we could treat the water. Okay, those were the two or the three options that we had specifically if we answered yes to the first question. And one thing that was consistent across all these different options was that we had to do a yearly inspection of the irrigation system. That's how it used to be. Specifically to the microbial water quality profile, how did that look like? So for pre-harvest water, meaning everything that was before harvest, these were the criteria, microbiological criteria that was given us. A geometric mean of 126 CFU in 100 mils of water for generic E. coli, or a statistical threshold value of 410 or less CFU in 100 mils for generic E. coli. And that was the microbiological criteria that we had to follow. And if we met the criteria, then we could use the water. If we did not meet the criteria, then of course we had to implement corrective actions. And the alternative provisions that we had was if, for example, the water is not meeting that criteria, we could use some sort of die-off rate either in post-harvest or in pre-harvest, or if not, we could treat the water. That was, in a very, very simplistic way, how the microbial criteria was for pre-harvest waters. For post-harvest waters, of course, impacted direct contact with produce, food contact surfaces, and hand washing. And of course, the criteria for this one was basically here, no detectable generic E. coli in 100 milliliters of water. And so if we had meeting, or if we were meeting this value, then of course we didn't have to put into action any corrective actions. But if not, of course, corrective actions need to be implemented to bring back this water to that value of 0 or less than 1 colony forming unit in 100 mils for generic E. coli. And that was applicable for what? For ice, for post-harvest water treatments, for hand washing, for washing of food contact surfaces. Those were the two criterions that we were given back until December of 2021. Now let's move on into the new proposed rules, okay? In the new proposed rules, like I said before, farms define what is the sanitary quality of that water. And that is a key component, okay? That's a very key component. Now, what are some of the key aspects that have disappeared? The microbial water quality profile disappears now. And water testing requirements have been removed from the rule and are only optional, okay? And again, the new requirement was this one, that farms determine the sanitary quality of the water, okay? To be able to determine the sanitary quality of that water, then the new rule is proposing for growers to do basically two approaches. One that is called an agricultural water assessment, which is this one here, and we're going to talk about it in detail a little bit more, or try to see if you can meet some of these exemptions that we're talking about. And so what does these exemptions mean? That you could treat the agricultural water and therefore you're meeting a specific criteria. Which criteria? The one that you define. If you have public water systems, that then you're going to go and get a certificate from the municipality that tells you that water meets the requirements for that municipality and that public system. So in that way, you're exempt. Or if you are having a groundwater system or a well, that you test for generic E. coli, and that test basically comes back with a 0 E. coli in that groundwater. So those would be kind of the three options that you have to be exempt from this agricultural water assessment, okay? And I'm gonna talk a little bit more of these exemptions later on. But for now, let's focus on the agricultural water assessment. And what does that mean, okay? In the agricultural water assessment, the key aspect, and I love these slides. I don't even know how many times I've used this slide. I'm putting this here because the grower, the farmer, needs to define the microbial safety of the water. So we have always used generic E. coli, but now it means that, for example, a grower can find some other scientific information that makes him follow a different path. So just for discussion purposes, let's say that somebody decided to follow pathogenic E. coli as that microorganism, or somebody decided to follow Salmonella. It doesn't matter. The point is that you have to have scientific information that allows you to define that microbial criteria, okay? And this is just as an example only to reflect the decision that the farmer has to make to define whether the safety of the water is adequate or not, okay? Now, when you're doing the agricultural water assessment, there are potentially three outcomes, as it says here. These outcomes can be that the water is safe and you're good to go, that the water is questionable, meaning that there could be some risks associated with it, and that therefore you have to do something to make sure that this water is safe, or that the water is unsafe and you need to stop using water immediately. Those are the three potential outcomes of the water assessment, okay? But how do we do a water assessment, or what is it that is expected of us in this water assessment? We need to identify the hazards, okay? The hazards associated with that water. We need to make sure that there is a written process. So you need to have a written written agricultural water assessment. And what do you need to have in that agricultural water assessment? So the first thing you need to have is a description of the system. What does that mean? The location, the type of water you have, the degree of protection that you have. And the degree of protection is measured based on 4 things. It's based on whether you're close to animal intrusion, like here, or biological soil amendments of animal origin, or if you're close to human waste, you know, portable bathrooms or things of that nature, or if there are other adjacent users or environmental conditions or other relevant factors that impact the safety of the water. And this is important because the mitigation practices that we have to put in place are going to be different for this group, like I mark here, group 1, that from this group, okay? And so what I want to make sure that it is clear is that when you start your agricultural water assessment, the first thing you do is that you describe the system based on location, type, and degree of protection against these 4 items. And then the mitigation practices are going to be separate or different based on whether you are in group 1, which will be close to animal intrusion or biological soil amendments or human waste, or if your risks are more associated with environmental conditions or water use, okay? And we're gonna talk about those 2 groups a little bit further later on. The other thing that you need to describe here are the practices used for irrigation, meaning if you use furrow, drip, irrigation, for example, and how close, what are the intervals of that irrigation close to harvest at the beginning of the season, you need to describe that information. Another aspect that you need to describe in this agricultural water assessment is the crop characteristics. And this one is a difficult one because that crop characteristic is based on what? According to the FDA, to the susceptibility for pathogen adhesion and internalization. That one is a hard one, okay? And we're waiting for FDA to get a little bit more information regarding this. But in the agricultural water assessment, you should list whether your crop may be or not susceptible for pathogen adhesion or internalization. The fourth aspect that you need to include into your agricultural water assessment is the environmental conditions of the farm. Do you have frequent heavy rains? Do you have extreme weather events? What is the air temperature? What is the sun exposure? Okay, that description needs to be included in that water assessment. Other relevant factors could be if you are, for example, doing some sort of water testing. If you're doing, remember that it's not a requirement now, it's something optional that the grower can use. So if you are using some water testing, you can use that water testing in this agricultural water assessment to define the risk of your water. This is the same as before. The annual inspection of the water system is been one of those few things that stay within the previous requirements. And one of the new things that need to happen or that needs to be much more defined is these expectations to maintain the system during the year, during the cropping year. And one of the things that we're still looking for clarification is, for example, regular monitoring for hazard identification. What is regular? Every day, every week, every 2 weeks, every month? What is regular monitoring? Of course, irrespective of that, you have to make sure that you do correction for deficiencies, that you keep your water sources clean, that you avoid pool waters. Of course, if you have a well, that's one of those key things that could potentially impact that. And that you properly store the equipment. And we're talking about irrigation pipeline or things like that, drip tape, all these aspects that could increase the risk of contamination of the water, okay? And then the final aspect that you need to sort of take into account, which in this agricultural water assessment, is that you have to review this annually or when there has been a major change in the agriculture or in the growing or in the water use system. Those are the 8 main topics, okay? So what were the outcomes of these agricultural water assessments, or what were the determinations? One of them was that the water is going to be safe. So if the water is safe, then there's no need for anything else. There's supposed to be no consider any hazardous in the system, and you can use the water. If the water is considered questionable, right? There is questionable safety of this water, then it is expected that you should be implementing mitigation and control practices to make sure that this water becomes safe. And of course, if the water is not safe, then you have to discontinue use and making sure that you make the necessary corrections if you want to continue using this water, okay? Those are the 3 outcomes from the agricultural water assessment. Now, let's dive a little bit more into number 2, which is when we have questionable safety. Okay, and when we have questionable safety, it means that we have to put into account mitigation and controls to make this water safe. And of course, this is going to be based on what? On the hazard. If you remember from earlier in the presentation, we had grouped those two hazards in two. Group one, that was associated with biological soil amendments, human waste, and animal intrusion, and group two, that was associated more to natural environments and other uses within the system. So the question is, what do I need to use or what do I need to do within my agricultural water assessment if I find myself either in group one or in group two? And we're gonna get into this right now. So if we find ourselves in group one, and just to make sure that I remind everybody, group one means biological soil amendments, human waste, or animal activity. You need to implement all these 6 actions within the same growing season. And this is one of the key aspects here, within the same growing seasons. What does it mean? If there has to be any repairs, if you're going to use any intervals between harvest and application of water, if you're going to apply any alternative mitigation measures, or if you're going to change the method of application, or if you're going to treat the water, all these 6 aspects that are going to make your water safe need to be implemented within the growing season, when the risks are associated with proximity to biological soil amendments, human waste, or animal activity. Again, within the same growing season. Now, what happens if we find ourselves in group number 2? And group number 2, to remind everybody, was people that were that we have other water uses here, or that we have other relevant environmental conditions. So if we have those scenarios, then we need to implement the same 6 practices that I described to you before, but as soon as possible or as soon as practical, and no later than 1 year. So the main difference between 1 and 2 is the time that we have to be able to implement those 6 practices. In the case of low risk conditions like other uses, relevant factors associated with the environmental conditions, we have up to 1 year, and we have to do it as practical as possible. If we have high risk conditions, animal intrusion, proximity to biological soil amendments, or human waste, they need to be implemented within that same growing season. And what are those 6 items? Any repairs, any intervals between the application of water and harvest, like here, or any mitigation activities, or any change in the method of application, meaning going from drip to tape, from drip to sprinkler irrigation, for example, or if we're treating the water. So the 2 main differences between group 1 and group 2 is basically the time that you have to implement those controls. But the controls most likely could be the same, okay? Now, what are other aspects that are also important to consider here? One key aspect here that I want to make sure that it is clear here, if you have reasons to believe that the water is not of adequate sanitary quality, you must discontinue use immediately. This is one significant change in the language of the rule, okay? If you doubt the safety of that water, you must discontinue the use immediately. And after that, then you have to, before you reuse this water, you have to make sure that you inspect, that you make changes, and that you confirm that those changes work. Or if you decide to treat the system, that the water treatment that you're using allows you to meet that microbial criteria that you are going to establish to be safe. So the results for this evaluation and for this process will basically tell you whether you're safe, your water system is safe, or your water system is not safe. Now, what are other key aspects that are related more to the exceptions within the rule? So remember, water testing is not a requirement, but it's an option that you can use. And if you want to use this option for testing, you can either use it for or within your agricultural water assessment, or you can use it for meeting some exemptions. So specifically for underwater, for groundwater that is untreated, meaning well water, there is a path for exemption. And that path for exemption is basically that you take in year number 1 4 samples, and that all 4 samples come negative for generic E. coli. If that happens, then the next year, you only take 1 sample during the growing season. And of course, this sample has to be also negative for generic E. coli. If the sample comes back positive for generic E. coli, you have to discontinue use immediately, fix the problem before you can start reusing the process. Okay, so you discontinue use, fix the problem, you do the test comes back 0 for generic E. coli, and then you can start reusing your well water. So again, to summarize, this exemption is if you have well water and that well water is untreated, you could collect 4 samples. Those 4 samples need to give you 0 for generic E. coli. In year number 2, you only need to take 1 sample, and that sample has to be negative for generic E. coli. If that sample comes back positive, then you have to discontinue use, fix the problem, do some retesting before you can use it again. Okay, and like I said before, these testing systems can also be used for what? For implementing alternative provisions. And this is, for example, the interval that you can take between the last irrigation and harvest, like in this example that I put here, or in cases in which, for example, you know that there is a water system that has not been used because the water quality was not good, and you want to use it again. But in order for you to be able to use it again, you need to do testing to make sure that that water meets the microbial criteria that you want. So if, I don't know, if you had a well or a surface water that you were not using because you knew that it was unsafe, if you want to start using it again, testing is an approach that you can follow to be able to bring it back into use. Finally, one other key aspect that is important that we always have to remember is records, right? And within records, of course, there are things that are new and things that have stayed the same. So we have to have a written agricultural water assessment. This is a must. You have to do an inspection of the agricultural system. Within this written agricultural water assessment, you have to include descriptions of the factors evaluated and written determinations to figure out whether that water is safe or not. What does that mean in English? It means basically the 8 steps that we talked about that you have to follow to make sure that you determine that that water is safe or not. And of course, you need to be able to have scientific data that supports the microbiological criteria that you're going to use. So summarizing this and sort of highlighting this in red, the 3 new things are those highlighted in red. The black aspect or the black letter here, it's something that comes from the previous rule, which is the inspection of the water system. All other 3 aspects are requirements or written records that are necessary for the proposed agricultural water assessment. Okay, so just to finish up a little bit and with some important things that are available to use so that we can then move into the questioning process. There are 2 publications now, this one 154334 and then publication 15447 that give you a little bit more background into these agricultural water assessments and into this agricultural new agricultural water rule. So I strongly suggest that you just basically Google them up in this way and you download them and have them with you and give it a read and compare some of the notes and descriptions that we have here today. Other important links, if you want to find the proposed rule and where it is, you can basically go to this first link here. There are some supplemental documents that talk about the water rule that you can also find here. These are PDF documents that you can download that can help you in your decision process. The FDA was going to develop an agricultural water tool. This agricultural water tool just was published 2 days ago. So I have an example for you guys here so that you can see this agricultural water assessment document. And as Adrian mentioned, any comments that you want to submit to FDA, you can also follow this link here to be able to submit them. FDA is really looking for real life applied scenarios that they can use in their rule making process. So if you have some good examples specifically about your farm, you can put these examples. You don't need to provide significant details specifically about like the location of your farm or things like that. They're more interested into what is it that is going on, what is happening, and how is the rule impacting your system. Now, specifically for this tool that FDA just published 2 days ago, this agricultural water assessment tool, you can find this tool here. Okay, and what I did, I just did a screenshot of how it looks. So I've done this water tool probably 3 or 4 times just to sort of see the different permutations that you have available. But if you go to that link that is written right up there, then the first aspect that shows up is this. This is welcome to the Agricultural Water Assessment Builder. And it basically sort of describes the nuances of the system. Okay. When you start doing this, please know that it is a voluntary process and you do not need to annotate your personal information to be able to complete the tool. When the tool starts, it's going to ask you your email, it's going to ask you your name and all the information, but you're going to see in parentheses that it says optional. All the assessments that I have done, I haven't done with putting any of my information, and I still get the report at the end. Okay, so please know that this is voluntary, that you don't need to put your information to be able to complete the tool. It's going to take you about 30 to 45 minutes to complete this tool, so please make sure that you save some time. When you complete the tool, you're going to have 2 options for saving this information. My suggestion is that you select the save option for reviewing. It's typically on the right side of your screen. Why? Because then that allows you to download a document, a PDF document that you can save or keep for yourself. Okay. And of course, this PDF document is only, and I want to make sure it is clear, is only going to summarize your answers. It's not going to tell you the safety of your agricultural water. Okay. You're going to save the document. The document is basically all the answers that you put in that document, and the document is not going to tell you whether this water is safe or not. So at the end, this is an example of one of the ones I did. One of the key assessments is that if you do this, I want to make sure that you know these 2 disclaimers. Does not constitute FDA approval for agricultural water assessments. So this is just a tool for you to get familiarized and learn, and that it is your responsibility to be able to make sure that this water meets the criteria. Okay, so those are 2 very important assessments. And then at the end of the document, it basically ends up in this scenario like this. Thanks for using this tool. Please note that the proposed rule, if finalized, will require cover farms to conduct an agricultural water assessment and take appropriate actions under section 112.43. That's how the whole system ends. Okay, so again, when you finish the assessment, you are not going to get an assessment that says your water is safe or not. What you're going to get is a summary of all the information that you put in, and this will be kind of like the final disclaimer that it is in the document that you get. Okay. So to finalize, what are the key messages? FDA for now will enforce discretionary, will follow enforcement discretion for subpart E. What does it mean? That if you are a grower that needs to meet the requirements for the product safety rule, when they go to their farm for doing an inspection, they're going to inspect all the sections of the rule except subpart E. Why? Because subpart E is specifically to the water. And what they are going to expect is that you're following good agricultural practices to maintain this water source. Okay, all other provisions will be enforced. One suggestion that I have for you is, you know that there is a tool now available. Please go ahead and familiarize yourself with this process. It doesn't hurt. You don't need to put your personal information. You don't need to put anything like that. You can do it under different scenarios and sort of get a summary of what you have. If you're not familiar with risk analysis, I suggest that you become a little bit more familiar with this process and how you do this analysis so that you can understand what practices you have to implement or how do you address these risks within your water system, especially if you have wildlife, biological soil amendments, or if you have human waste around you. If you decide to treat the water, you need to make sure that you're following a scientifically valid process and that you document that information, okay? I have seen many people already using water treatments that do not have a sound validation process. So if you're gonna decide to treat the water for now, because this is tied to what? To following good agricultural practices, make sure that you're using a scientifically valid treatment process. And if you want to, please provide comments to FDA. You can go to this docket here that I just indicated here before, or to the link that I showed you before to provide these comments. Another option is to contact the Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, Adrian, Marilyn, and many of the other wonderful folks that we have here in this association, and or Martha Stallings. I want to make sure that I give a shout out to Martha too, because she's responsible for the food safety team within the Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association. So you can provide some of that information so that they can sort of summarize it and put it together. And with that, I am done. I want to thank you very much for your time. And I think we have about 10 minutes for any questions or comments.
That's great, Eduardo. Thank you so much.
Yep.
I am looking at the Q&A, and I think Seth asked a question and then decided maybe he found the answer to it. Seth, are you good to go on that? Eduardo, do you want to answer it?
Sure. There are some revised options for die-off. And so I want to make sure that I clarify this. If you're using water, irrigation water, and all of a sudden you realize that this water doesn't meet the criteria that you want, the microbiological criteria that you want, then the FDA gives you alternative options. And what those alternative options mean is what can you do to still be able to use that crop or still be able to harvest that crop. One of them is that from the moment that you apply the water to the moment that you harvest, you wait a specific time before you harvest the crop. So going back to Seth's question, yes, there is still some of those alternatives, but now the bar has been moved a little bit more towards the grower. So the grower has to decide what is that alternative time before harvest and provide the necessary justification to justify that extra time. But yes, there are at least 3 potential new provisions that will take into account application of water before harvest, or if you harvest the crop, how long you can wait during the storage time, or if you're washing the produce, what interactions with that washing may have or not. That is still not fully clear, but those provisions are still available. Hopefully I answer your question.
Sounds great. And to build off of Seth's question, I remember previously, University of Arizona, I think, was one that developed a calculator. Great, Seth, that looks good. That where based on the lab results, we could calculate that die-off. And is that still part of what growers should be considering as to how to use that time interval? And would it also include to the end of storage? You know, would you combine both of those?
So there are 2 water calculators. Those 2 water calculators are from the University of California, Davis, and from the University of Arizona. Both of those would allow you to calculate a die-off rate, but that die-off rate was based on the previous microbial water quality profile that the rule was giving us. Now that criteria, that microbiological criteria has disappeared. And now the grower is the one that defines the microbiological criteria for their own water. Okay. So one thing that we don't know, for example, is if you want to follow the previous criteria, would that be okay? Which means I could still use the water calculator to determine die-off rates. But we don't know if FDA is going to accept those as still valid. We don't know that information. So to be succinct and answer your question, maybe you can still use them. It will depend on the grower's decision to basically decide if they're going to follow that microbiological criteria that FDA was giving you before. And then the question that we have is, if FDA going to consider that to still be valid? And I cannot answer those questions.
Okay. How previously growers would remark as this was rolling out, we're all feeling sort of concerned about it, is there sufficient data to support that the high degree of ultraviolet radiation in Colorado should be considered as sort of a mitigating factor in this? Because I saw sun exposure in one of these criteria.
I don't think there's enough information right now to be able to succinctly and categorically say that that is the case. Yes, there is evidence that UV light increases die-off of organisms. I just want to caution everybody thinking that if you are applying water through sprinkler irrigation, and this is a leaf the bacteria could land here, or the bacteria could land underneath here. If it's land here, you have UV light, it's going to die most likely. But if it lands underneath, that may not happen. Okay. So the risk with following that approach is that we do not know exactly where the bacteria is going to land. And if it lands in protective areas, it doesn't matter how much UV light you have, you still are going to have a risk. So I think, yes, UV light will be important. Yes, most likely it will be an important consideration. And therefore, that's why they're being asked you to put that information about sun exposure. But it goes back again to the beginning, which is, what is the risk I have? Am I mitigating sources of contamination in my water source, so that if I use that water and some of that water has the organism and it finds itself in a protective area, can it still die? Can I still control it? So anyway, that is one of the hardest ones out there. But yes, there is some evidence. Sorry.
Again, about the die-off option, he's asking, what are the criteria that, if the previous calculators, is that still undetermined? How we calculate die-off?
Well, no, you can still calculate die-off, but again, if you calculate die-off based on a specific parameter, right? The minimum number of generic E. coli that you want to have, for example, as it was before. But now, if you have to define your own microbiological criteria, then that die-off has to be based on these new criteria that you decide, right? So if you decide to go with the previous one, then you can use the calculator and still calculate how many days you have to wait to meet that microbiological criteria. But we don't know if FDA is going to accept the growers to use that previous criterion. So yes, die-off can be calculated. Yes, die-off can be used in many different scenarios. It's going to depend on the initial microbiological criteria that the grower defines to be safe.
It feels to some that the grower determining what that level is another layer of risk, that they haven't, how will they choose a benchmark if they're not really versed in this area to know?
Yeah, I think that's a very hard one. And that's why sort of understanding risk and risk analysis is going to be important. But one that is not talked about quite a bit is that the grower has to decide whether their crop that they grow is susceptible or not to attachment and adherence of human pathogens. And I think that one is a difficult one. I understand the spirit of why it was written that. There's been a certain number of outbreaks associated with certain crops compared to the other ones. I just don't know how easy that's going to be. And I think that one is another one that would be pretty hard to be able to have enough scientific information to justify whether you think it's a high risk or a low risk.
Yeah, it seems forward looking based on future research. We might be able to answer that question better, but we just don't know right now so well for all different produce items.
Yes, and there's a lot of research going on. There's a lot of my colleagues are doing some monumental and amazing work, and more information is coming there. But each state, each growing region is different. So can you use information from Michigan in Colorado, or can you use information from Washington State or from California? Those I think are some of the nuances that are going to impact your ability to use the data and whether it will be robust enough for the operation that you have.
Yeah. We're down to our final minute, and I had one more question, not seeing any more in the chat, that I've heard other growers think of. It's sort of, we think about killing pathogens. So what are emerging or current scientifically valid treatments for ag water? That's another new field, right?
Okay, so we have been washing produce for who knows how long. And of course, we have sanitizers that have registrations from EPA for washing produce in packing facilities. But we don't have a single sanitizer out there that has an EPA registration to treat a human pathogen on irrigation water. The registration information that we have there is for treating plant pathogens or for treating algae. So with having said that right now we don't have a sanitizer that have a registration specifically for killing human pathogens by EPA, there are different published treatments for irrigation water that are going to depend on so many parameters. How much organic matter do you have? What is the pH of the water? What is the contact time of the sanitizer? Can you acidify the sanitizer? There are so many things. So in order for you to be able to find one that is effective, you need to find first a published document, but then you need to be able to grab that published document and then implement it in your farm so that you can follow it exactly as it is. And I think that that is one of the hardest things that is available. Yes, there are new technologies. People have been using UV light, but UV light has some, it works with low volumes of water. If you have 60, 100 acres in which you are pumping 60 gallons per acre per minute, the length of tube of UV light tube that you need to have to be able to treat the water is going to be very, very long, and it's probably going to be very, very expensive. So yes, UV light could be used, but under certain circumstances. And then there are new companies that are developing some new sanitizers that do not have the same issues that chlorine or to a lower extent that peroxyacetic acid have, but these are still not registered. So everybody's pretty eager to try to have them out there as an alternative provision. And of course, there is other information about filtering and other aspects, but still a lot of research has to be done in that field.
Well, I think that's a good theme to end on, that, you know, there's more to be learned here. So we all need to stay tuned and figure out the emerging research to answer these questions. So Eduardo, thank you so much today. Great working with you. And everyone, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Appreciate you very much. Thank you, guys. Hopefully it will help you in some way. Have a good day. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.